I'd also like to thank you for allowing me into your homes for the 17th edition of Season 4 of Esoteric Science Roundtable. And I would like to briefly announce that we will not be having a metaphysical philosophical meeting for the month of March. So again, the third Wednesday in April is the next time that we here at Esoteric Science Roundtable, and the folks over at their 4am, Jeff Contreras and crew, will be having our next metaphysical philosophical meeting. So hang tight until then, and we'll begin once again. Let's see. Okay, I want to base today's show around an email that I got relatively recently, sometime in mid-January. So for me, that's pretty current as far as email goes. So I do apologize for that, but this is really relevant, and I've been meaning to address this in a full show format for some time. So let me go ahead and start by reading the portion of the email that is relevant. Let's see. And this is from a viewer named Sam. So I want to thank Sam for sending this. Last night you talked a little bit about Project for a New American Century and the mentality that those leaders have compared to the Nazi era, and also comparing that to the potentially positive results of a group of leaders coming together under a single unifying vision for humanity. I have thought about this myself, mainly wondering how a group that is becoming powerful and influential can know that their vision is the right one for humanity at large. For example, I myself have always been torn between the two conflicting political philosophies of progressivism, finding the common good for society and making sure everyone has access to the necessities of life, human rights, etc., and the philosophy of libertarianism, leaving government out of human affairs as much as possible and leaving them free to pursue happiness in the way they best see fit. I sense that there is some way to reconcile these two views, but I feel that each one by itself is too limited and has to merge with the other somehow. Anyway, to keep my question short, do you have any thoughts on what kind of role government from an esoteric perspective should have in shaping or molding the ideal human society? And so again, this is something that I ponder quite frequently, and so I wanted to kind of delve into this a bit further and address some of these ideas. And to consider, in essence, as the title indicated, what is the greater good? How to proceed in any society to try to make sure that the greatest good is done for the greatest number of people. And certainly, most folks would agree there are certain basic things that all humans would deserve by virtue of being born on this planet. Clean air, fresh water, food, housing, clothing. These are the simplest things that we can consider. And from that, springing from that, employment perhaps and things of that nature. But the very, very basics are just the things needed to maintain the human vehicle and to keep it healthy and functioning properly. And so most would agree that these things are right and proper for all of us to have ready access to. The means of how this is going to work itself out is what is much contention is based upon when it comes to these considerations. And so the contention usually falls back on, how are the services going to be provided, who's going to pay for them, and how are these people going to earn the services? Are they going to have to work for them? Is this going to be some sort of a social program where things are handed out to people that are deemed needy enough to get some sort of a handout from some sort of a established social system? Or are they going to have to earn it in some way, have some sort of a job or do some sort of service in order to get to be able to have these things given to us, or to have some way of exchanging for these basics. And so these are the age-old questions. They've been with us since mankind has been around. And so I want to consider from a governmental perspective and start with some relatively recent history and consider in terms of how a situation was implemented in order to achieve a greater good situation. Now, this is certainly a questionable, the motive behind this event is certainly questionable, and rightly so, and this is why I think it's right to delve into these ideas and to try to give this some honest looking into and assess this as honestly as we possibly can. And so I want to consider starting with the events right before World War II. And part of the campaign promise that Franklin Delano Roosevelt had made was that he was not going to get us into any more conflict, that people were still definitely remembering the First World War, and that was not that long before in history, in our history, in the world's history. And so that was definitely something that most people had no taste for. They did not want to get wrapped back up into any kind of a huge conflict. And so that was part of the campaign promise. One other thing that FDR has been quoted as saying, and that is that, and I am paraphrasing for the most part here, that there are no accidents in politics. And so in light of that consideration, when we think about the Pearl Harbor event, it's relatively well known through history and academia that the codes had already been cracked, and we were quite well aware that the Japanese were on their way to Pearl Harbor. And so chances are that could have been prevented, the event could have been prevented, or it could have been at least, it could have been lessened to a considerable degree with adequate preparation, which we allegedly, and according to history, had access to. We did know that they were on their way. And so, but nonetheless, FDR allowed this incident to play out the way that it did, and he allowed even going as far as to turn the planes inward facing each other so that they couldn't adequately take off and defend the base. And so that's one component. Also, some may be familiar with the fact that there were many Americans on some islands, I think it was either in the Philippines or near the Philippines, and they were left out, and they were purposefully left behind. Supposedly our naval ships took off and just left these people behind. And this was also something that was used to create the proper climate and the proper attitude among the American people, that they would be outraged enough that they would demand that we go to war and declare war on Japan, and by virtue of that, be declaring war on the Axis powers, Italy and Germany, and what was unfolding at a world scale. And so these were the considerations that FDR was having to make in light of some information or some influence that he was receiving. Again, considering that there are no coincidences in politics, and that at some level FDR had to either have been impressed with the idea that he should goad Japan into attacking us, or he was influenced by some persons, what have you. This is really not abundantly clear, but again, by virtue of the quote that he himself gave, which is that there are no accidents in politics, we have to consider the causative events. Now, from one level, considering the World War, and especially considering World War I, before World War II was about to break out, the more spiritually minded individuals and aware individuals on the planet did have their own intuitive network in place, and there was advanced warning, if you will, that there was an impending another world scale event about to take place, another world war that was about to potentially take place. And so at many levels, the spiritually minded, esoterically minded individuals were polarized and focused, and did amass their energies and and pool their resources to a certain degree. Now, not in the sense that they all gathered in one location, but that in the respect that they all gathered their contemplative and meditative energies and directed their energies individually to the greater task at hand, which was to try to stave off this upcoming conflict, which was becoming near impending at that point. And ultimately what took place was these individuals and the men and women of goodwill globally did not meet with the adequate energy to counteract what was taking place. Through a lot of karma that had taken place throughout humanity that had been built up for a long period of time, these events were allowed to play out. And so we can look at the unfolding and the creation of Hitler from several different levels as well. we can look at the comic unfolding in that this was a cyclic opportunity for evil, or the forces of darkness, if you want to, whatever term you would choose to use, to amass and move behind a certain group. And they saw the ripe and ready opportunity to do this to particular people that he had gathered around him, and to a lesser degree, the Japanese and Italians. And so, by virtue of this relationship, what in essence took place was that these dark forces, in essence, possessed Hitler. And also, there may be many that are familiar with the fact that Hitler was very much into the occult, and there was the so-called Vril Society and the Thule Society that were originated during that time, and they were very much Nazi black occult groups that tapped into this dark influence, and that allowed this possession to manifest into these ordered rituals. And so this took on a greater component throughout Nazism. This became regimented, and this became indoctrinated in the philosophy of the Nazi regime to a large degree. And so this very brutal totalitarianism, or totalitarian attitude, began to crop up and to be very, very firmly focused with much intent, and for all intents and purposes, evil focusing through this group, through this cabal. And so the workers for the good, if you will, or the Great White Lodge, the White Brotherhood, those that work behind the scenes to help humanity to find its way through evolution and try to give us the positive indications that we need in order to progress, again, in a positive fashion, towards love, understanding, inclusiveness, and towards an understanding of the soul nature. And so there's always this faction waging war, if you will, behind the scenes at the interplane level, and they've made their way to physical plane warfare. The most maybe not well known, but the drastic events that took place during the Sinking of Atlantis, and what culminated in that event was a huge fight that took place between the Black Lodge and the White Lodge. And so this found its way back to the physical plane through the World War I and World War II, pretty much considering them one continuation of one conflagration, that this was one huge war that extended through that time period, more or less. And so the Nazi regime was certainly possessed, if you want to use that term, by evil, and so they, by virtue of this, were trying to carry out their vision for humanity, which was essentially a vision of enslavement and a vision of subjugating the many for the power and the pleasure of the few. And this kind of attitude has always rooted itself up through many regimes in the past as well. And so certainly Rome is one consideration that we can bring into this discussion as well. But from time to time, we see ruthless individuals rise up, but nothing really had seen the level of evil manifesting itself on the physical plane as had demonstrated itself through the Nazi regime, and again, to a lesser degree, to Japan and Italy. But this evil outpouring had to be met and focused by those that work on the inner planes for the greater good of humanity. And this was, I am quite confident, part of the influence at some level that influenced FDR to goad the Japanese into attacking. One thing is very key to consider. The White Lodge is not a preemptive strike kind of crew. They are very much more of a defensive posturing, and again, using circumstances for the liberating of humanity, and so that ultimately we can work towards some system that will be uniform enough to be inclusive enough without, again, oppressing individual freedoms, liberties, free will, and things of this nature that are so crucial to the very essence of being human. And so waging war at these interplane levels, again, as the Dark Lodge, White Lodge, and so the White Lodge did definitely, in this instance, take the sides of the Allied forces. And so they threw their energies and efforts into supporting on that side of the conflict, which they'd really never supported a conflict in this manner before. But these dire circumstances caused them to proceed in this manner and to again encourage the U.S. and the Allied forces to wage the fullest war that they could against the forces of evil, if you will, manifesting through Hitler and his regime. And so this made its way to the physical plane and manifested into the second aspect of the World War. And so, not to mention, there's the material plane aspect of it as well, that there are humans that are playing into greater or lesser roles within the playings out of wars and all these all the political ramifications, the movings and the shakings behind the scenes, and what plays out and pans out as a relation in regards to these relations. And so we consider behind the scenes what took place in the Nazi era, and we can see that many corporations, even companies here in the States, were funding and propping up Hitler. And so really Hitler could not have taken place, and this possession could not have taken place if there weren't willing participants in the financial industry, in the financial districts, in the sense of the bankers, and manufacturing, in the manufacturing industries. And so there had to be those that were willing, again, to finance and to build the machinery, the war machinery. And this is much like what's going on in our current day conflicts, that there are so many profits to be had, there's so much money to be made through war and through bloodshed, that it entices a lot of people to go ahead and get involved at some level, whether that's the stockholder or whether that is the executive, the board member that's calling the shots for how their business should proceed. But it is truly unfortunate that in this day and age we still profit, we still make money from war and bloodshed, and this, I think, unfortunately, is going to maintain itself for some time to come until some certain definite things take place. Now, ultimately, obviously, the Nazi regime was defeated, and that influence was kind of put back into check to a certain degree. And considering it from esoteric symbology, the door where evil dwells has not been completely sealed, although evil has been relegated to its correct place. But it hasn't been sealed. The door hasn't been sealed yet, so we're still seeing very much a last-ditch lashing out from that faction until, again, the door is properly sealed and that is relegated to its proper place in the greater scheme of things. And so, again, Christ and the Church Invisible did at that time side with the Allied forces and encourage them to, again, wage war with Germany and these other countries. And then flashing forward, if we consider the current conflict and the current regime that is carrying out an aggressive tendency or policy on a world scale, we look at the Project for the New American Century fueled Bush regime, and we can consider what's going on with their movings and shakings right now. Now, their policy essentially states that it would be nice to have a Pearl Harbor-like event in order to help galvanize and coalesce a lot of the efforts that they are in favor of. And so certainly 9/11 could be considered a Pearl Harbor-like event that did help to initiate a lot of what the Project for the New American Century and other assorted talking heads were babbling about it, were trying to influence the public towards. And so again, we see different individuals, different corporations benefiting from the war machine, making money, and so money oftentimes is going to influence policy to a large degree. So we find, again, a faction going into another area and using aggression. I would say this does differ drastically from what took place during the Pearl Harbor incident, in that it is true that we allowed some bad things to happen in order to get into the war, and we did goad the Japanese into attacking us. but we did not have an aggressive outburst towards another country. We essentially tricked them into attacking us. So I don't know if that's really better. Ultimately, we could be getting into kind of rationalizations and things of that nature, but there's no question that there is an aggressive policy and a preemptive strike policy that the current administration has here in the States towards other countries and other regimes. And so this preemptive, proactive strike mentality, I feel like, is considerably different from what had to take place in order to take over or to reclaim from some possessed individuals the opportunity for liberty and expansion on the globe. And so what's happening now with the current aggressive tendencies, I don't really see them, again, being quite at the same level, and they're definitely taking exclusively, and they're not really allowing for some might argue that they're allowing for a certain climate to take place, and I'll get into that in a second. But I feel at more like an esoteric level that the Bush camp are maybe more obsessed than they are possessed in the classical term as like an exorcist kind of condition. But nonetheless, I do feel like that they are adversely influenced energetically from an esoteric level, and so I think that is driving and motivating them to a certain degree. And again, certainly power and the chance at profits is certainly something that we can't discount as well. Now, okay, so this new event took place and allowed for new movings out, and obviously the target being the Middle East. Now, some would point to the fact that there were elections held in Iraq as a good thing, and they would point to that as a positive step in the right direction, and they might consider giving some credit to the Bush regime and the conflict in Iraq. Also, with Syria currently pulling out its forces from Lebanon, that is, that maybe not have been too predicted from too many camps. It seemed like that was a surprise to many. Also, the legislation for Lebanon recently resigned. And also, Egypt is going to hold elections and allow for challengers to the current president, Hosni Mubarak, who's been in power since the early 80s. And so for the first time in his reign, he's going to have the potential for challengers. Recently in Bolivia, the leadership changed hands, and there have been mass protests in all of these countries lately that have ultimately, I think at some level, fomented these changes in the leadership. But again, we have to get back to the idea of there being no accidents in politics, and the fact that demonstrations aren't just organic and instantaneous. There has to be direction, there has to be motivation, and there have to be leaders and organizers behind the protest. And so this, again, is a further point of consideration. And it's also a further point of consideration as to whether or not any credit can be given to the Bush administration for the fact that these regimes are changing, or at least on the surface look to be changing, and that there does seem to be a wave of some change taking place. I don't know if it's going to pan out into a demand from the public in these respective countries for more freedoms, or if it's going to ultimately lead to an opportunity for more U.S. puppet types to be propped up and placed in these respective countries, and then there would be a control level taken over from that level, at that perspective. That remains to be seen. And so, again, this is a real. It's very interesting, the timing, certainly, that all this seems to be happening simultaneously. And so I don't know if this is going to pan out into something akin to what took place in the late 80s when the Berlin Wall fell and a lot of the former communist countries became independent to a greater or lesser degree. So is this a similar wave that's going to be taking place in the Middle East? And how is this going to pan out? This is really the curious question as far as I'm concerned. And how do we proceed with respect to the greater good in this area? Because there are certainly different factions, as there are in every other place in the world, that are going to have varying interests. And so it's again curious to see how this is going to play itself out. How this is going to work in relation to Israel, and how that, is there going to be a Palestinian state? Is there going to be, how is Israel going to continue in light of these changings and this changing tide that seems to be catching on again in this area? So this again is. It's going to view, I think, it's going to merit some viewing the situation, and also moving forward with caution, and definitely proceeding with some caution in this area. Also, the idea that let's see, there are a lot of other countries as well in South America that are also in a lot of turmoil. Again, I've mentioned Bolivia, and Bolivia's leadership that just recently stepped down. And so again, we're finding that thousands and thousands of people are gathering and massing in these different areas, and they're trying to, and they're politicking their respective leadership, and they're trying to bring in apparently more freedom for individuals. And so again, this remains to be seen as to how this is going to pan itself out. Now, I want to also consider, again, more from an esoteric perspective, how some of these pannings out might be viewed, and from an energetic level. If we consider that there are varying energies, and that they're traditionally considered to be sevenfold, that influence at any given time what's manifesting and playing out on the physical plane. And there are various components of that. And so if we consider different countries, they're going to have a ray quality, if you will. And so there's going to be an energy that characterizes the personality of each nation, and there's going to be a ray energy that qualifies or characterizes the soul nature. And this is the same in individuals and humans as well, that we have a personality ray and a soul ray. And this is going to be in conflict or in a state of flux or turmoil, depending on the orientation of the person or the orientation of the nation. And just to consider one of the rays that's very much in line with today's discussion, it would be ray 1, will or power. And the first ray, or the ray of will or power, is the ray that the dictator finds himself on. And this is the ray that is also akin to the Hindu symbolism attached to Shiva, the destroyer. And so this attitude, this my way or the highway mentality, is what causes a dictator to come into power and to reorient and rip apart the old way to make way for his perceived vision. And this, again, this finds its way through a Hitler, or through, I certainly feel that the Project for the New American Century is first ray, and its aggressive mentality and its aggressive stance. And so this is certainly a personality component. And as to an organization having a soul ray per se, I can't say that the PNAC guys or the PNAC group would have a soul necessarily any more than like the Boy Scouts would have a collective soul necessarily. Although there's something akin to that. There's an essence on the inner planes, if you will, that would be akin to the causative energy behind these outer manifestations. And so, again, nations are going to have a varying level of evolution, and so in most cases, if we can look at some of the more westernized countries, if we look at the U.S. or we look at Britain, we see that at the soul level we have the second ray, which is love or wisdom. The love or wisdom ray or energy or essence is the essence that underlies the entire system, it underlies the entire universe, and it truly is what we are synthesizing towards, is unified understanding of love. And one material plane component that's going to have to connect with the spiritual plane is the understanding and knowledge of the soul. And so as mankind is able to acknowledge the soul, and as a result of this understand its fractal nature as it reflects through a ray, any particular ray, again in an individual or a nation, that this will allow us to get greater insight. And psychology certainly will be able to gain from this knowledge. And as people are able to ascertain their ray nature and their orientation towards either the personality or the soul, then much progress can be made. And so as far as answering the question about what government would be ideal from an esoteric perspective, to answer the email that I initially read from, it's really going to be a matter of just trial and error for the most part until we gradually come to an understanding of the nature of the soul. When that is factually accepted among all men scientifically and as just an everyday common fact that, oh yes, we have souls, that we will recognize there is one soul for all humanity and that we have one indivisible energy, and there's one God that manifests this one soul and moves through and creates through the soul and allows for manifestation to take place and for the physical vessel to be created and for everything that we see in existence to play out and evolve. And so we'll be more concerned with the nature of the soul as we understand and can discern and determine that there is a soul initially to begin with. This is really going to be the key component that's going to hinge on how we proceed as a race collectively and how we respect nation and groups of nations as there's different trade blocks build and then dissolve, and then we will eventually work towards a synthesis, a synthetic system. The problem is that there is still the energy of evil that has not been sealed properly behind its door, and it's not relegated completely in the way that it should. It still has its tentacles and tendrils reaching out into our humanity, into creation. And so it's still influencing to a large degree, like a noxious vapor, really. And it's still emanating out, and it's still causing us to kind of be dizzy from its glamour, its maya, its illusion, and its misleadingness. It is untruth, and it is all those things that lead us away from our soul nature, our inclusive nature, what is real truth. And so as this is allowed to still, again, emanate out and still affect humanity to a certain degree, we're still going to have factions of humanity that are going to try to make aggressive moves, and they're going to work towards their own system of synthesis. So you have the dual factions working towards systems of synthesis. You have the Black Lodge and you have the White Lodge. The Black Lodge is trying to influence, in the simplest terms, a system of enslavement, a global system of enslavement that will allow for a handful of minions working through their influence to create an enslaved globe and to enslave our free will, enslave humanity at all levels. Conversely, you have a group, Christ and the Church Invisible, the White Lodge, the Brotherhood, the Masters of Wisdom. They have many titles that refer to their collective group and their workings out. And this body of executives works to instill free will, right human relations, love, inclusiveness, and more understanding of the nature of the soul, and ultimately past that, the nature of the spirit. And once we get a firmer understanding of the soul, and then again leading to the understanding of the spirit, or making our will one with the Father, which is one of the highest culminations that we can achieve as humans, individually or collectively. And we will start working towards group movings towards understanding the soul. And this will take on a greater component in the future, that collectively we will work in groups to uplift each other. And the ray types of individuals are going to influence which groups gather. And so there'll be second ray groups gathered under second ray teachers, and there'll be first ray groups gathered under first ray teachers, and so on through the remaining 7 rays. And these will encompass and cover all aspects of human endeavor. And so again, as the soul becomes more acknowledged in humanity, And as humanity starts to spontaneously and organically pop up in various places around the globe and offer their assistance. This is not going to be something that's going to be led by some leader. It's not as if Christ will return and then try to just whip everybody into shape. What will really have to orient itself on the physical plane before any teachers can reveal themselves and start to work again in an intelligent fashion with humanity is that we're going to have to get our game together. We are going to have to, again, have these pockets of instantaneous organic growth just arise in their own areas around the globe, and that these people will just know. They'll come to the table with a sense of knowing as to what they need to do in their own area. And so these little ripples will join with other ripples of other pockets of people around the globe, and this will start to cause the sorts of tensions and changes that I was describing earlier that are taking place in the Middle East, that are finding their way into South America, Central America, Africa, certainly to in various ways, other ways. Unfortunately, it's not taking the places in mass demonstrations as much as it is in mass killings, cullings, and conflict. But there is this is just a further indication of the turmoil that's taking place globally, that these ray influences are playing out. Now, certainly you're going to have different groups and factions that are going to try to take control at various levels. You're going to have different societies, secret and otherwise. You're going to have United Nations endeavors and all their various modalities and their peacekeeping and their all their humanitarian efforts and otherwise. But again, you're going to have, by virtue of influence of energy, different factions trying to work out. And this is a multi-level, multifaceted situation, certainly. You can certainly point to different groups of movers and shakers and follow the money on the physical plane, the exterior aspect of it. Follow the, find out who gains and follow the money. And that's always one way to gain some understanding from a physical plane. But then from an inner plane perspective, we have to consider what the proportion is in an individual or a country as far as their personality nature in relation to the soul nature. And those countries that are collectively tapping into a greater soul awareness, these are the types of countries that are going to be able to uplift other countries and be the way showers for other countries. And certainly the U.S. is the prime country that should be setting a blazing path for all the rest of the countries to follow, in the sense of amalgamating different groups of various people from around the globe into one country, one melting pot, and proceeding collectively under one set of laws, one set of recognized laws. Again, this was based on an influence, and our nation was based on an influence of individuals that decided through various organizations and means that they were going to make their way here. They were going to establish something based on liberty and equality. And again, any endeavor you look back at in history had its causative start. And this is, from an esoteric perspective, you look at what was the causative energy. From, again, in the physical plane level, we look at who gains, who benefits, follow the money. From the esoteric levels, or the inner plane levels, from the mental plane, if you will, we want to look at the causative nature. What was the initiating impulse? What was the motivating factor that initiated that energy and put the whole works into effect to begin with, and created the tension around which something manifests on the physical plane? And so again, there are always going to be groups that are going to be playing out. And again, you can look at the most extreme with the Black Lodge, which is looking to enslave humanity, White Lodge looking to free humanity, and then various shades of gray in between, with people having various levels of allegiance to one or the other. Oftentimes individuals have no understanding of these groups, but they feel compelled or impelled by some idea, some impulse, and they feel that they need to carry out some work on the physical plane. This may be, again, some religious reform. This might be social reform. This might be financial reform. Any number of things. that some individual may all of a sudden just decide to pick up the torch and run with and try to make something new or rework a certain system. And the idea that ideas are just random to individuals that's very foreign to esoteric science. Esoteric science, again, looks at the causative, the mental portion, and considers from mind, not the physical brain, obviously, but the mind nature that is outside of the physical and that we can tap into as one collective, just like a tape recorder, basically. We can fast forward and rewind and play, real time. And so we can discern from understanding mind a lot of the energies that are playing out. And so we can consider again from the causative level, what exactly is playing out through any group, or what combinations of energies are playing out through various groups, and why or individuals, and why are they feeling compelled to express some particular ideology or work along some certain lines. And so again, we can see various aspects of this all along and throughout the spectrum that are trying to play their hand or trying to influence what's transpiring at many different levels. And so to be able to successfully ascertain and gauge how all these different groups will work out is next to impossible. And this is the task that both these groups, actually, the White Lodge and the Black Lodge, are charged with, in essence, that they're both keeping an eye to a certain degree on those that are working in various fields. And so they're basically supporting, in a sense, by giving their energetic influence, in some cases giving an outright hint and communicating at some level with an individual or heads of state or whatever the case may be. And also conversely with the Black Lodge, that they would also have their means to influence and manipulate humanity in order to bring about a certain goal, a certain set of ends. And so again, these groups are constantly viewing and assessing the scenes, and they're constantly working and reworking the various plans that they plan to enact in order to carry out for either the greater good in the sense of the Christ and the Church Invisible, or the greater subjugation of the greatest number in terms of the Black Lodge activity. And so again, this wrangling continues to take place, and it will continue to take place farther into the future. Now, there's also an esoteric writer named Rudolf Steiner who was a spiritual scientist, and he was able to delve into the realms of mind and see far into antiquity and also potential future. And one thing that he was able to glean from a potential future is that far into our into humanity's future, still. This also ties in somewhat to Revelation as well, when you consider that there is a moving apart of heaven. There will be a new heaven, essentially, and a new earth. And we can look at this as, in essence, those that were able to make the grade and able to pass the human class, if you will, or are going to move on to another condition, a more refined state of humanity. Those that were not able to make the grade are going to be resigned to repeat their grade, if you will. It's as if they were held back in school. And so this separation is going to take place, and according to what Rudolf Steiner, again, has indicated for a potential future, is that our physical features will reflect the nature of our hearts. And if we have love and we have inclusiveness in our hearts, then our countenance or our appearance will reflect that. And it will be evident that that is our nature. And we'll have the look of love, I guess, if you will. Conversely, if we're an evil person and we're into only selfish things and hatefulness and materialism, that we will reflect this in our outlook, and that we will appear ugly and materialistic and selfish and all these things. And this is, we certainly don't have any way of doing more than speculating on that as a hypothetical potential for the future, but it's certainly something to consider. And if indeed this were to take place, then this would solve the problem of who would be a good leader and who would not be a good leader. Now, even considering this as a hypothesis, this would be considered to be hundreds of thousands of years in the future. And so this is something that we really can, we wouldn't be able to practically practice just yet, but it's something to perhaps consider for down the road, that if this does manifest itself along these lines, that again, it will be a bit more evident, and it will be readily apparent as to who should be in a leadership position and who should be looked out, who we should look out for if they have the appearance of, again, the material nature. And so we'll have to wait and see how that works itself out. Let's see what else I want to get into here. Now, again, as far as the greater good is concerned, this can be expanded out to other areas as well, past just plain ideas of just government, and which government is going to ultimately rule or reign on the globe. Now, again, considering a lot of what's written in esoteric writings, we're going to have much more time left on the globe than maybe some folks would like. Certainly some of the Christians that have the rapture mentality may be somewhat fearful that they're not going to, that they won't have a quick release to some sort of, preconceived paradise, but that we will have to slug it out for a bit longer, and that we will have to work through this human form for some time to come yet, and we still have to much evolving to do, and much growing and creating to ultimately work through. And so this is what esoteric science generally lays out, or collectively does agree upon this, as to what the time cycles will be and how long all this will still carry itself out remains to be seen. But we likely do have quite a bit more time left on the planet, and I think this is going to offer us ample opportunity to keep working on getting it right. This test and trial that is humanity, that we still we have definite opportunities. We've really made a lot of progress, and you can pick any point in the past and take a quick glance forward, and you can say, yes, progress has been made. Right human relations, goodwill among men and nations has been expanded, and the greater good has been expanded over the globe. Now, considering we have 6 billion people to care for, that's an interesting situation too, because the money is there. We have ample funds. I mean, the money is created and printed, so there's no real shortage of real funds. If we want to print up the money to take care of all these institutions and all these efforts and endeavors and all the social programs, all this stuff could be financed and there would be no problem. But then you have to factor in worth, self-worth. How do we earn again? How do we gain the services and the basics for life? Is it something that's just going to be handed out to people? These are the things that we still have to work through, and they're still going to be the haves and the have-nots, I think, for some time to come, until again we can start to recognize the soul as one among humanity, and one universal quality or component that ties us all together. This will solve these things. And that may seem oversimplistic, but the recognition of the one soul in humanity, once that is, again, understood, then profound changes take place in an individual, and they take place in a group fashion if that can manifest itself in a greater number. And so again, once that acknowledgement's made, then drastic changes take place, and a sense of responsibility finds its way into the mentality and into the very life of an individual once they start once they have realized that the soul is universal among all men, and that even the lesser kingdoms in nature have their soul component to a lesser degree, that aren't self-conscious and self-aware as humanity are, but nonetheless they have their own lesser component of divinity. And so we have, again, a responsibility to uplift the lower kingdoms, in addition to continue our own evolutionary process. And so everyone, again, can do something to make a little ripple in some area to help alleviate suffering. Again, not everyone's going to be inclined towards some governmental institution, whatever. Everyone's got their own area of expertise that they can gravitate towards, and they can make some change. Again, once the sense of responsibility kicks in, once the nature of the soul is acknowledged to some degree, then rapid progress will be made. Humanity will be able to fast come upon a definite renaissance, and we can have a revitalization of what allegedly took place thousands and thousands of years ago in the Atlantean times and other times in which there was communication and sharing worldwide. And so, again, how are we going to proceed globally, and how do we consider what will be the greatest good for the greatest number of people? And also, is credit to be given to, in the instance of what's going on in the Middle East? Do we need to give George Bush and his crew any credit for what's transpired? I have a hard time, ceding that over to them. I really feel like that is not something that action, that aggressive action, has earned or even instigated. I don't necessarily feel that these people are fearful of any kind of reprisal from the states. I think that more so there's an inherent need for freedom in humanity, and this has to find its way into expression. Now, whether this comes at the end of a gun, at the end of some foreign occupation, these things are going to have to play themselves out. It would be my hope that there's a peaceful explosion of understanding, and that populations among nations try to work out their own issues without outside interference. Even as far back as the days of George Washington, he encouraged us to avoid entangling alliances with other nations. There can be mutual cooperative exchanges among nations without there being entangling, and that is the key. But again, getting back to the FDR quote, with there not being anything in politics that is an accident, that things are done purposefully, and that there is a cause behind the scenes. As I said, viewing things from an esoteric perspective, we always look at the energetic cause behind the scenes. So as this manifests and plays itself out, we can recognize and have some indication as to how things are going to play out. We have some leading indicators from considering energy in that respect as to, again, what may actually happen. And so this is pretty much the most interesting time I can think of in recent memory for me personally. And so I think a lot of people the people that are alive on the planet right now have an opportunity to partake in this. We really are right at the pivotal point in which we can collectively push this towards a more positive, greater good scenario, or we can be reclusive and we can relinquish our birthright, which is to be engaged, to be battle ready, and to live life, to get our hands dirty, and to really be expressions of creativity, to be expressions of the divine here in the physical plane. That's our birthright. We can shirk that responsibility. We can run, and we can either pretend everything's okay, or we can just deny that that there's anything going on. So that's really up to us. I think I'm going to try to grab a call here in the last minute. Hello, caller, you're on the air.
Hi.
How's it going?
Talking about good versus evil and everything that's going on.
Mm-hmm.
We had to have it set up here where there was going to be all this dissension, where we were going to have the evil coming, so that we could come down here and learn our lessons we needed to learn for our soul to grow, which we couldn't do in a positive environment such as heaven.
Mm-hmm.
It's fast. And also there's something about polarity, integration, and, each individual having their shadow selves.
Mm-hmm, yes.
Things that, we're not, in the shadow, we don't want to claim them, but, when you get to start learning more about it, you see that, we each have our own
baggage.
Bad side, evil, whatever. I mean, it's not, I don't really like the word evil, but,
Well, I would say baggage might be
where
something.
we can all do things that are not good that we can see in somebody else. It's interesting to me. to watching TV, and I'm watching somebody, and I go like, they're a jerk. They're acting like a jerk, and I go like, okay, now how do I act like that sometimes?
Good point.
And whenever I'm writing something, then I come in and say, okay, now how have I done something like that to get a lesson out of it? And then about the term again, polarity integration.
Yes.
And so I guess I'm kind of trying to take this from a personal level, and I guess I'm trying to tie up some of my thinking here that I'm a little bit, about the door of evil hasn't been sealed, okay, and so it's still here, okay. So, are we supposed to integrate this evil, or is this just going to be something that's eventually going to go away, or something? I mean, you know what I'm trying to say?
Right, I think I follow you. I would say that as more individuals, as more humanity is able to integrate in their own personality and relegate that shadow nature to its proper place and to accentuate the nature of the soul, overriding the personality, that alignment is the key alignment that we need, that spiritually minded people ultimately are seeking. They're seeking to bring the soul nature into the physical, everyday waking understanding, and that's called enlightenment by a lot of people. But as that enlightenment becomes more commonplace, then evil will be relegated. It'll also, if you read the Bible narratives, Jesus comes with a sword. The sword is not so he can come kick a bunch of tail, it's so that he can cleave. The sword has esoterically always been a symbol of cleavage. And so he's cutting off the lower nature. And also, if you are familiar with the imagery of the saint or the knight in armor, and he's cutting the head off of the demon or the dragon. He's got his foot on the dragon, and he's slaying the dragon. And that also is a symbol of that, the lower nature being slayed by the higher, more spiritual aspect of humanity. And so, again, I think it's more so just relegating evil to its proper place. It's in manifestation in this universe for a reason. Again, as you said, for us to learn our lessons, for there to be that polarity, for us to be able to contrast from and play off of. If we didn't have that, if there's a perfect world, then we wouldn't be able to learn and grow and expand. So everything you've said, I agree with. But it's after we've finished with it, then it needs to go on to its right and proper place and have its own evolution as it needs to. And I don't really even want to speculate on what that may be, the further evolution of evil, as long as we can depart from it, adequately enough so that we can continue our own soul growth. And I think that's the key thing to consider.
Okay.
All right. Thanks a lot. I do appreciate you taking the time to call. Have a nice evening. Yeah. So, again, I think once we acknowledge the soul, both scientifically and collectively, that in the public, that catches on more so, that we'll see a lot of changes taking place as a result of that information, the factual nature of the soul being considered. This will change a lot of things. This will change everything. And so people can make their own choices of their own volition, of their own free will. And the coercion and the subjugation that we see that's all too common in this day and age can take its own backseat as well. We need to respect our fellow humans as adults and give them the proper space and the proper and adequate time to do what they need to do. I want to thank my producer, Chris, for commanding the helm of the Starship Esoterica. I want to remind folks that we're here every Thursday from 8 to 9 p.m., Channel 11. Also check out Therefore I Am, Jeff Contreras, and Fine Crew every Tuesday, 10 p.m., Channel 16. Thanks, Austin. Have a nice evening.